All right. Hey, it's good to see you all again. So, another read aloud. You ready for a story? Cool. This one's called The Inside Tree. It's by Linda Smith, and the pictures are by David Parkins. I'm excited to read to you again. I love reading with you guys. All right, The Inside Tree. Mr. Potter, no relation to Harry, lived alone in a little house just the right size for him and his teapot. His house sat on a hill no bigger than a bump, and there was just enough room in his yard for a single tree. But a finer tree Mr. Potter could not imagine. Birds circled and dipped through its twisty top branches. Mr. Potter's dog slept beneath its lacy lower boughs. Each evening, Mr. Potter took his tea in by the fire and thought warm, comfortable thoughts. It was a perfectly cozy arrangement until his house, little hill, tree, dog sleeping under it. Perfectly cozy arrangement until one night. Mr. Potter looked out his parlor window and saw the dog looking in. Some nights are dark and cold, Mr. Potter thought, and the moon throws eerie shadows. Somehow, it didn't seem right that the dog was never invited in or allowed to sit by the fire. So Mr. Potter decided to bring the dog inside. You're an inside dog now, Mr. Potter said, patting the dog on the head. But something about the dog reminded him of the tree. And there was something about that tree that bothered Mr. Potter. What could it be? He asked himself, staring thoughtfully at the ceiling. Quite suddenly, it came to him. Now that the dog was an inside dog, there was no one outside with the tree. Mr. Potter could not get that tree out of his mind. It nagged at him like an itch that would not go away. Somehow, it didn't seem right that the tree was never invited in or allowed to sit by the fire. Inside dog, outside tree. So he decided to bring the tree inside. The next day, Mr. Potter fetched his shovel. All afternoon he worked, digging little half-moon slices of earth around the tree. Finally, it fell away from the dirt, roots and all. The dog barked excitedly as Mr. Potter wrestled the tree onto the porch and pulled it inside. Then he cut a nice big hole right through the floorboards and set the tree down in it. You're an inside tree now, Mr. Potter said. The dog lay under the tree like old times, and Mr. Potter could not imagine a finer evening. This is quite a cozy arrangement, he commented to the dog. What's going to happen? Then, one day, Mr. Potter noticed something. The tree had grown. The twisty part at the top scratched the ceiling. The lacy lower boughs were trying to sneak out the window. It wants to go outside, Mr. Potter decided. Mr. Potter's dog groaned. Whoa. Mr. Potter went to the barn and fetched his saw. He propped a ladder against the house and climbed up on the rooftop. Then he cut a nice big hole right through the shingles. There, he said, I've let a little bit of the outside inside." The tree sprang through the roof and out into the sunshine. That night, Mr. Potter sat with the dog and gazed up the dark, starry sky. "A nice view," Mr. Potter smiled. "It goes very well with tea." By morning, the birds had discovered the handy hole in Mr. Potter's rooftop. Whippoorwills whistled on the window sills, magpies marched across the mantel, robins roosted in the lampshades, and 4 fat blackbirds rudely bickered over the sugar bowl. But the tree looked just like its old self. Mr. Potter was glad about that. Everything was perfect. Until... it began to rain. On the first day, Mr. Potter said to the drenched dog, "Don't worry, it's only a spring shower." On the second day, Mr. Potter fetched his umbrella and sat with the dog drinking rainwater tea. "The floors need a good washing anyways," he sighed. On the third day, Mr. Potter's chair floated right out the parlor door and into the yard. "This is not a cozy arrangement," he admitted. A little bit of rain, more rain, so much rain. What's going to happen? On the fourth day, the rain stopped. Mr. Potter waded into his house. Roots snaking up through the floorboards. Seedlings sprouted in the sugar bowl. Vines invaded the pantry shelves. 2 frogs swam in the sink, and a nest of sparrows had hatched in his teapot. Now, there was more than a little bit of the outside inside. Mr. Potter stood with his hands on his hips. "This will not do," he declared. Mr. Potter dragged his chair out to the barn and sat down. The barn was big and airy and dry. It smelled sweet from hay. It felt very cozy, too. The dog curled up in a dusty little corner and fell asleep. Warm, comfortable thoughts began to fill Mr. Potter's mind. Mr. Potter went back to the house and dragged his stove from the jungle. He shook the sparrows out of his teapot and plucked a lone cricket from his teacup. Just as he reached the barn door, he heard a loud crack. 4 great booms followed. Boom, boom, boom. The walls of his little house fell away, crashing to the ground. The tree stood all alone now. There was nothing around it and nothing above it but the dark, starry sky. Just like old times, Mr. Potter thought to himself. A few weeks later, Mr. Potter sat in his barn, admiring the new fireplace he had built. The floors were clean, the pictures hung from the walls. Mr. Potter could not imagine a finer evening. "This is a cozy arrangement," he commented to the dog. Then, something about the dog reminded him of the tree. And something about the tree reminded him of the house. The house reminded him of the barn. And all of it together reminded him of something he could not quite put a finger on. What could it be? He thought to himself, staring thoughtfully up at the hayloft. He stood and looked out at the pasture beyond. There, he saw one of the loneliest cows he had ever seen. Mr. Potter could not get that cow out of his mind. It nagged him like an itch that would not go away. Somehow, it did not seem right that he and the dog had that big old barn all to themselves, and the cow was never invited in or allowed to sit by the fire. Some nights are dark and cold, Mr. Potter thought, and the moon throws eerie shadows. Mr. Potter looked at the dog. The dog looked back at Mr. Potter. What would you think, he mused, if I invited that cow in for tea? That dog walked over and nipped him right on the seat of his pants. Ooh! Well then, Mr. Potter sighed, perhaps it was not such a good idea after all. The dog slept very well that night, and so did Mr. Potter. And that's the end of our story. Oh, that was nice. I had never read that story before. What do you think it would be like if you brought a tree inside your house? What would your parents say? Oh, man. Pretty funny little story. Well, thanks for listening. Hope I can see you guys soon. Keep watching the videos. We got the botany videos, and we have more read-alouds. So, hope you guys check them out. Bye!